Welcome, everybody. I'm Matt Helmer. I'm the Managing Director of the Economic Opportunities Program. It's great to have you all today for this exciting conversation, reentry and good jobs, building the second chances we all believe in. This event's actually the second part in a little two-part series we've been doing called Work Behind and Beyond Bars, Improving Job Quality During and After Incarceration, in which we try to look at the challenges that people have with labor and work when they're incarcerated and behind bars, and then some of the challenges and opportunities they have, hopefully when they're released in the labor market. So this conversation is also part of our larger series called Opportunity America, in which we try to look at the changing nature of economic opportunity in the United States and really try to think about how we create an economy that works for everyone. Before we get started, just a few technology notes here. Everyone's muted. Please use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit and upvote questions. We have a really large audience today. We're not going to get to everyone's questions, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please use that chat, though, to share your perspective, your resources, your ideas, anything you want in there. If you want to post about the conversation on any social media platform, we use hashtag #TalkOpportunity. If you do run into any technical issues today, you can message us in the chat or email us at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org. We are going to record this event, of course. You'll get a recording via email, and we'll also post it on our website if you want to take another look at it later, or if you have to leave early. Closed captions are available for the discussion. You just have to click that CC button at the bottom of your screen. Stay tuned for our next event on March 19th, in which we're going to look at the challenges of workers in the trucking industry. But let's talk about today's discussion. As I said in part one of this series, we really took a closer look at prison labor and the need for dignity, human rights, and opportunity for people who are working behind bars. Today, we're focusing on those returning home from incarceration, who often face very similar challenges when it comes to finding stable, dignified work. When we were putting this discussion together, we talked to a lot of people, a lot of inspiring work going on out there, a lot of organizations doing great work around supporting those at reentry, everyone from those involved in workforce development to affordable housing and healthcare. Just a tremendous amount of great work going on around the country, really embodying, I think, the values that we all aspire to, or most of us aspire to, around equal opportunity and second chances. This event has actually drawn our largest audience ever, which I think speaks to the challenges of this work, but also speaks to the commitment of this work and the hope for addressing some of the barriers we're going to talk about today. So we've made a lot of progress on those values when we think about equal opportunity and second chances. But I think as we're seeing today, we're starting to get pushback against some of those once again. So we still have this long road ahead, I think, to realize these values of equal opportunity and second chances. And I think it's important to say, too, that, many never even get that first chance. As I think many of us know on this webinar, opportunities often unequal. The zip code that you're born into often impacts your future and your opportunity more than anything else. And a second chance is also hard to come by. It's hard to come by because so many of our jobs today in our economy don't provide fair wages. They don't provide benefits. They don't provide the conditions that allow people to lead stable lives. So for many, limited access to good jobs is not just something they experience when they're coming out of incarceration, but for many, it could have been a contributing reason why they went down the road of becoming incarcerated in the first place. So I think, I'll just close out by saying, too often I think our ideals of equal opportunity and second chances, we all aspire to those, we all hope for those, we all have a deep commitment to those, but oftentimes they run into and clash with discrimination and racism and policies that really block access to quality jobs. And we all know that quality jobs, not just a job, but a quality job in the context of today's conversation, is really important in preventing recidivism. And too often, those leaving incarceration or those with a record, they're forced into a job very quickly, oftentimes at the expense of a good job. So these challenges, like I said, aren't unique to many Americans. Many Americans are struggling to access good jobs today, but those coming home from incarceration have some unique barriers, and we really want to dive into those today. So we'll discuss how we can rethink our policies, our mindsets, our incentives, our funding, and our systems to hopefully expand access to good jobs for those coming home. And we have a great panel that's going to explore this today. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague now, Amanda Fenns, who we call Finny, who's a senior research associate on our team, who's going to say a few words and introduce our first speaker. So Finny, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Finny, and I'm a Senior Research Associate with the Economic Opportunities Program. And it's my pleasure to get to address you all today and introduce our opening speaker. Today's conversation, as Matt mentioned, is going to focus on the challenges that are unique to those who've been previously incarcerated. Those who are looking to rebuild their lives after release are often faced with insurmountable odds in finding work while simultaneously having little support and, in fact, many obstacles for doing so. Often, prisons lack viable opportunities for career training that folks can take with them once they've served their time. And afterwards, they're forced to enter the workforce at a disadvantage, often facing barriers such as occupational licensing restrictions, employer discrimination and exploitation, needing support for things like health and housing, while still navigating systems such as parole and the impacts that that can have on a burgeoning career. It's our hope that you all will take away a deeper understanding of these challenges as well as a few solutions for how we can improve job quality for those previously incarcerated. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, Sappho Fulton. Sappho is the CEO of Women Beyond Borders, managing pre-entry services in county jails and re-entry services in Center City, Philadelphia, demonstrating her commitment to supporting marginalized communities. She is also a current Change the Narrative Fellow at Women's Way, where she's honed her storytelling skills to challenge assumptions about incarceration and advocate for a liberatory economy. Sappho's personal journey, including over 20 years of involvement with the carceral system, followed by nearly 2 decades of successful reintegration, adds depth to her professional expertise in reentry and second chances. And we're so honored to have her here with us today to kick off our discussion. So I will turn it over to you, Sappho.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sappho Fulton. And I just want to kind of go straight into the stories. Thank you for reading such an excellent bio and introduction of me. So yes, so my experience with the carceral system. I want to talk about, like, I'm overcoming 30 years of hard crack addiction. I'm born in the 60s, so I came through the hard crack era. So we're talking about unaddressed mental health, unaddressed substance abuse usage, homelessness, yeah, and not able to find a job. So I think that, finding a job was like, the least of my worries coming out of the carceral system. It was like, I don't know what to do, because we're talking about the trauma of incarceration. We're talking about like the culture adjustment, because you live and exist in a culture inside the penitentiary, and you learn a behavior of survival. So when you come home and to re-enter society, there's an adjustment. And there is a learned mannerism that may not always be as accepted in certain communities, and that's the one thing, the biggest challenge with, I think even doing the job interview, because I'm going through an experience, and as an individual coming home, I want to get a job, I want to work, I can work, and I'm going to be a good worker. But I don't know how to really fill out an application, and I really don't know how to interview. And my mannerism may come off a little awkward in a professional space. So that's one point. And I'm going to leave some more room from some other people to add some things there. But we're talking about like major barriers, like back to back, not being able to. So summarizing some of the experiences and looking for work after being incarcerated, I never had a job. So I don't even know what kind of work I was looking for. I know that I didn't want to do a labor job that was going to pay minimum wage, because my thought process was, I got to get a house. I want to meet back with my family. I want to be, respected in society. I want to have some things that are substantial. For me, my experience was I decided to go back to school. And I did everything they wanted me to do. I did everything that was, of normal and acceptance in society, more or less, because it was like, go back to school, get a degree, do something to better yourself so you can get a good job. So I did that. I got an associate's degree. I got an undergraduate degree. I've traveled the world. I got 2 master's degrees. I got a PhD. So let me stop at the second master's degree. I got a master's in organizational leadership and a master's in social work. So then when I went to take the test, I don't know where all these brain cells came from, because I promise you I smoked most of them during that 30-year period of addiction. But when I got the MSW and I went to go get my licensure for the MSW, they were like, oh, you have felonies on your jacket. You can't get a licensure. You need to go through different procedures to get a licensure. So to me, what I heard is fear, rejection, and no. I'm not saying that it was impossible, but it was a very strategic challenge of trying to obtain your license with robbery, with gun possession charges, with possession with intent to deliver. I'm not talking about any homicides, and I'm not talking about any sexual assaults. I'm not talking about any child endangerment. I'm talking about things that come along with substance abuse usage. So that was problematic. So I went even further to get the PhD. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a license with a PhD. I've been pretty successful in 20 years. I'm still struggling with trying to get a pardon. Yeah, so when I go to a job, it always comes up. And we were talking about this the other day when I was talking with Finney and Matt, and I was saying, like, even today, I finally found someone that would let me work under their licensure as an LPC. And so I can get at least an LPC, because most of our funding say you have to have a licensed practitioner. Now I have a private practice, but so I finally found someone to let me work under the licensure. I was saying that the challenge, the fears that come up with moving forward to even fill out the application for the licensure. Now, listen, I am outspoken. I think I'm pretty assertive, but those paralyzing fears have almost stopped me from completing the application for the licensure. I've been working under this licensure practice for 6 months, but I don't understand that until I get right in front of it. So, supports. One of the things that I designed with my program is a reentry supportive services. The other thing that we designed with Womxn Beyond Borders is that with all of my fears, I still keep pushing forward. I go inside the jail and I do planning inside the jail. I meet with people where they are. I do parenting with men, parenting with the women. I work with trans folks. I work with LGBTQ folks. And then we have a wraparound reentry supportive services. And we just don't stop with, hey, listen, get a job. We're like, some of the barriers that are coming up, like literacy issues. People can't read. I remember one of my sentences, I went upstate, up Muncie, and I tested on a 2nd grade reading level. Was I unable to read? I thought I could read, but substance abuse and induced mental health conditioning had proven otherwise based on testing. Do you know what I mean? So those things come up. So when we're talking about like policy and standards, now we don't have the DEI programs. Now we don't necessarily have to work with compromised communities. We don't have to go above and beyond professional development. But I want to work. I want to show up. I'm committed to showing up. In fact, when we were upstate, we had to go to work every day or we would be locked in ourselves. We were some of the best workers and we work hard because we're overachievers, because we've done so much damage in life that all we want to do is just have another chance. So, and we deserve to be paid for that. We don't deserve to be underpaid at a minimum wage. Yeah. I hope I set the tone. I'm a little nervous because I had to do all that in like 3 minutes. So I want to pull back and then I'll be here for more questions and answers. But I think that, there's some stuff to unpack in there and we can add to whatever work that other folks are doing on this panel. Thank you.
Great job, Sappho. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And Sappho's going to be around for our audience Q&A towards the end. So hopefully we'll have some more time to hear a little bit more of Sappho's expertise and perspective on some of these issues. But now I want to turn to our panel. And it's a great panel. You can read more about them and their impressive bios on our website. But right now I'm just going to put names to faces so that we can get into the conversation. First, we have Daryl Atkinson. He's the co-director and co-founder of Forward Justice. We have Beth Avery joining us from the National Employment Law Project, where she's the Fair Chance Program Director. We have Sharon Dietrich, Litigation Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. We have Minna Long, Strategic Program Manager for the Washington State Building and Construction Trades Council. Minna is also a journeywoman ironworker with Ironworkers Local 29 out here in Washington State. And then finally, we have Gina Schaefer. Gina's a longtime friend of the Aspen Institute and someone we've had on previous discussions. She's the former CEO of A Few Cool Hardware Stores, which is in the DC metro area. And she's the author of Recovery Hardware, a nuts and bolts story about building a community and renovating lives. And it's our pleasure today to welcome Jamiles Lartey, who's the staff writer at the Marshall Project, to moderate today's conversation. Jamiles is the primary author of the Marshall Project's award-winning newsletter, Closing Argument, He was previously the reporter for The Guardian, where he covered issues of criminal justice, race, and policing, and was member of the team behind the award-winning online database The Counted, which tracked police violence in 2015 and 2016. He's been named the Michael J. Feeney Emerging Journalist of the Year in 2016 by the National Association of Black Journalists. Jamiles, glad you're here with us today, and I'll turn it over to you to guide the rest of today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Matt, for that introduction. And I really want to say thank you to the Aspen Institute for inviting me to participate in today's event. Reentry, rehabilitation, collateral consequences. These are all topics that regularly come up in my work on the Marshall Project's newsletter and just more broadly in our newsroom. And so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to dig a little bit deeper with a panel of experts who I think you'll find bring diverse connections and perspectives to this conversation. So to get started and kind of jump right in, I would really, we have a big panel, and so that's something that we're just going to have to manage. But I'd like each of you to take about 2 to 3 minutes to introduce yourself, talk about your work in this area, and talk about why this conversation is important. But I'd also really love for us to get specific and not just speak in broad strokes. So I'm going to challenge each of you to raise a specific story, person, a law, a moment, something that can ground us in the practical realm of this topic. And so I'm going to start with Beth. I'm going to ask you to please introduce yourself and any LP and give us an example that demonstrates some of the challenges that we're talking about today.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Beth Avery. For the past decade, I've worked for the National Employment Law Project as an attorney and the Fair Chance Program Director now. So NELP is a nonprofit advocacy organization with a mission to build a just and inclusive economy where all workers have expansive rights and good jobs. And so I think that's why this conversation today is so important, because the good jobs part of reentry is often overlooked and not given enough attention. And so, I mean, I think it was suggested that I should maybe ground us a little bit in some overview, some facts in the situation we're facing. So I think when I start explaining this issue to people, I highlight, the breadth and depth of this problem. We're talking 80 million people with some sort of record. That's nearly 1 in 3 US adults. And so it's broad. And we're talking deep, long-lasting, and unevenly distributed and nonsensical barriers. So, lifelong reduction in employment and wages, barriers to building wealth, upward mobility, families, communities, particularly communities of color, because we have a legal system that routinely criminalizes our communities of color. And I think that the fact that I need to underscore, and I think everyone needs to have in mind when we have this conversation, is that, there is no evidence that people with records are more likely to engage in workplace misconduct. Our current system takes for granted that criminal background checks help employers make better hiring decisions. And I don't understand why that unproven background fact gets to be the background assumption. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm going to move over to Daryl now. This work to support people coming out of incarceration with employment has a long history. So I was hoping you could tell us about yourself and Forward Justice, but also give a sense from your perspective about where this movement is today and where it's come from.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank the Aspen Institute for addressing this important issue. I didn't one day wake up and decide I wanted to co-found a civil rights advocacy organization. My life trajectory propelled me in that direction. In 1996, I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug crime, convicted of drug trafficking, and given 10 years in prison in the Alabama Department of Corrections. I wasn't offered any post-secondary educational opportunities. I went inside with the high school diploma, came out with the high school diploma. This is 1996, 2 years after the passage of the 94 crime bill, which ended any Pell Grant assistance to incarcerated people. Fortunate enough for me, I had a loving family to return to that provided me food, clothing, and shelter. I didn't have those immediate Maslownian pressures pressing down upon me, and I could think. and work a plan. I went back to school and got my associate's degree, bachelor's degree, law degree, been licensed to practice law for over 17 years in both Minnesota and North Carolina. And my practice area exclusively focused on the restoration of the civil and human rights of people who've been to prison and jail. So that's kind of how I got into work. And the origins, particularly of fighting against the structural discrimination that people with records and people leaving incarceration face, originated from those people. Grassroots organization by the name of All of Us Are None coined the term ban the box, which really was trying to get people a fair shot at being able to get a job where they aren't immediately discriminated because they have a criminal record, but you can assess them on all of their skills and qualifications. And I think that's critically important to really ground us in any of these particular policy prescriptions. The people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but the furthest away from power and privilege. We who have access to different power and privilege access on-ramps should be making space for those people to come with the solutions that they know they need. Folks know what they need. It isn't like some big science experiment that we got to have task force after task force to try to study and come up with solutions. Let's go talk to those directly impacted people about what they need. And what they needed was to stop getting their application thrown in the trash, even though they had certification and education and all of the necessary qualifications. So I'll pause there so we can make sure we can have a fulsome discussion. But that's kind of what brought me to the work, and what has grounded me throughout is being both willing to continue to grow and evolve and sharpen my saw, while also being humble enough to go to the folks who are suffering and ask them what they need and listen to them and try to actualize their dreams.
Thank you, Daryl. Next, I'm going to turn to Gina, and I'd love it if you could tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us about a few cool hardware stores and about what this conversation means to you today.
Yeah, thank you. Although I'm not sure how I follow that. I'm so impassioned now listening to that, listening to Daryl speak. I own and operate and founded 13 hardware stores in the DMV, members of the ACE Hardware Cooperative, actually. And so this conversation for me started almost by accident as my entrepreneurial journey started in 2003. And I'll just give you two quick anecdotes as to why this means a lot to me. Throughout the years, because of the way I accidentally fell into the reason I'm in this conversation, I was called things like a stupid employer, a crazy woman. Why on earth would you hire that person? And I was hearing these conversations or these comments over and over again, which really made me hone in on the stories that got me to where I was and why I was going to continue to use my voice, hopefully for some sort of good. The very first person that I hired in 2003 had been incarcerated for 17 years. And I did not know that because when I downloaded the application from a Washington, D.C. website, a district website, it had the box because it hadn't yet been banned. And I remember saying, well, that's a rude question. And I scratched it out. And Tommy applied for the job and I gave him the job. And probably about 6 months later, I became aware of his past. And he worked with me and taught me how to be a really great boss for 11 years. And I like to believe that I would have had that experience had I left the box on the application, but I'm so incredibly grateful that he kicked us off on that trajectory. My second teammate was in recovery for a crystal meth addiction and on house arrest for selling drugs. And the real moment of empathy for me, having never been having never had any experience with an incarcerated community in the past, I remember him saying that no one would give him a job, but he still had to pay his rent, which might sound obvious to everybody on this call, but to me it was, why would he not take an unsafe or unhealthy job or return to crime if he needs a place to live? And so this conversation means so much to me because of my involvement with the Aspen Institute and meeting so many folks who have worked for me, I've been able to realize that I'm not crazy. This is the way the world should be. There's so much that I still have to learn and can learn from, and that what we've been doing all of these years has been worth every second of it.
Thank you so much, Gina. Minna, I want to turn to you next and have you introduce yourself and tell us about the ironworkers and the work of the Building Trades Council in Washington and how that fits into today's discussion.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here. And I feel like that's also a very difficult one to follow, Gina. So essentially, the Washington Building Trades Council is an intermediary body that works on behalf of 46 different building and construction trades unions in the state of Washington. We work on policy and legislative efforts around mainly wages, benefits, working conditions, childcare, and apprenticeship. And as mentioned, I'm a member of one of those affiliated unions. I'm a journeyman at Local 29 Ironworkers. Fast forward to today and my current position, one of the things I have the honor of doing is advocacy and outreach for currently and formerly incarcerated folks who are interested in joining our affiliated apprenticeship programs throughout the state, no matter where they're releasing from or to, and no matter their circumstances. And how I found myself in this position isn't just because I am a member of an affiliated union, but I actually am formerly incarcerated, and I graduated from a prison-based pre-apprenticeship program that taught me how to be an ironworker apprentice. And so I joined that apprenticeship after my release, and then found myself here, lucky to be involved in helping those coming behind me. And since we've been challenged with this story, the first thing that came to mind is that I've been in this position for almost a couple of years, but about a little more than a year ago, I actually lost this job because of my record. And not because the people here didn't want me here, but because of an archaic federal law from 1959 that bars folks from essentially any a position in a union other than just being a member. And it was shocking to me when I reached out to folks for legal advice to figure out how to circumvent this issue and get my job back, because I am a born advocate, especially because of my life experiences. Nobody knew what I was talking about. So I had to go full pro se. It was one of the most devastating situations I've ever been in, but I ended up grassroots pro se getting my job back, and here I am. And now it's my mission to, absent being able to change that law, help folks know that it exists, know that there is recourse. At least here in Washington, there are a lot of options for post-conviction relief, and so that's become one of my personal and work missions to help folks with that. So.
Thank you so much for that. Last and certainly not least, Sharon, I'm going to ask you to please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the history of the community legal services and how it became involved in reentry and the clearing of records.
Thank you. I'm Sharon Dietrich. I have been with Community Legal Services in Philadelphia since 1987. CLS is the largest legal aid provider in the city, and I've been an employment lawyer the whole time I've been there. And my story has to do with the first time that I realized that criminal records were going to be an issue in my legal practice. Because honestly, at that time, in the late 1980s, employment lawyers around the country did not think of criminal records as being an employment law issue. But one day, or one evening, I was out doing some community education, and a man came up to me at the end and he said, "Listen, can you help me? I've got a record. I keep getting turned down from every job I applied to. It's worse now than it was when I got out of jail in the 1970s. Is there anything you can do?" And I remember this moment clearly going on 4 decades later, because I felt like my brain exploded at that time, because I'd never thought about this. And immediately it occurred to me that this has got to be something that is very important to a lot of people. And what on earth are the remedies? Because again, at that point, it wasn't even thought of as an employment law issue. So that was just the first person that I met who presented the issue of how their record kept them from getting work. And it was the first of thousands of people. This work really chose community legal services by who walked in the front door and what they wanted from us as an employment law matter. And the answer was that fully 2/3 of the cases that come to CLS of low-income Philadelphians who are looking for work have to do with criminal records. Out of all of the barriers to employment that exist, criminal records, far and away number one. And that led us to really think about what kind of legal and policy advocacy we could do to try to help our clients who had records. And we ended up devising a bunch of different strategies. First of all, discrimination cases to make sure that people were not being unfairly denied work because of their records. Challenging laws like what Minna just described that caused her to lose her job, where the employer might be perfectly happy to hire you, but the law says they're not allowed to. And we filed legal challenges under our state constitution and had many of those laws declared unconstitutional in Pennsylvania. We sued background screeners for putting out really awful product that didn't comply with the law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And most of all, we cleared records as expansively as we could because, as Daryl says, people know what they need and they come to CLS and they say, I want my record clear. And those are the sorts of work that we do, and I'll talk about them more over the next hour. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And that point about, what comes through the door being a big part of determining what the programming is, I think that was very well said, and something that people who work in these kinds of spaces should keep that thought in their minds. I'm going to stick with you, actually. I would love for you to talk to me about some of the challenges of discrimination against those with a record, despite there being some laws to protect those folks.
Sure. So when I first got involved in this work all those years ago, and we're talking now like late 80s, early 1990s, for like 2 decades, employers would say to me, well, yeah, you're here telling me this person should be able to work, but this is at will employment and I can do whatever I want. And what I want is to not hire this person. And it would often manifest itself as an across the board policy in which employers would say, you have to have a clear record or a clean record, however they wanted to refer to it, or you can't work here. Now, that is absolutely not legally correct. Fortunately, here in 2025, you don't hear that as much because it has, over the years, managed to be demonstrated to the employment community. There are limits on when employers can reject people based on their records. Many of them come from federal and state laws. The fair chance laws, the ban the box laws that you've heard about so far. And Beth's organization, the National Employment Law Project, has a wonderful webpage with a cataloging of those laws around the country, which I'm going to ask to be dropped into the chat for you to take a look at. But I would say also don't underestimate Title VII, the race discrimination law, the federal race discrimination law that prohibits employers from acting with race discrimination. There is a guidance put out by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission back in 2012 about consideration of criminal records and how employers were required to consider them. And there are a lot of nuances to what employers are legally allowed to do. So it is well worth your taking a look at that guidance to see what EEOC said, what kind of factors should be considered, things like how long it's been since a person's conviction, what their history has been since then, how they rehabilitated themselves, is the conviction related to the crime where they never convicted, and it was only an arrest. These are all really important things that are relevant to the legality of an employer right to turn somebody's down based on the record. And I'd ask that the link to the EEOC guidance be put in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Minna, one common challenge often cited in helping people at reentry connect to good jobs is the lack of effective education and training behind bars. Can you tell us a bit about that challenge and what is different about the track program in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the track program stands for Trades Related Apprenticeship Coaching. It's a Washington State recognized apprenticeship program that's located inside two of the women's prisons, Washington Correction Center for Women and Mission Creek Correction Center. And there are actually similar programs inside 6 of the men's prisons in Washington. So the programs themselves prepare students to enter several different apprenticeship programs in the community. So they're not only gaining entry-level skills to start those apprenticeships after release, but they're also getting to take advantage of the partnerships that those prison-based programs have with other community entities and with the apprenticeship programs themselves. And I really want to emphasize that the track program and its counterparts in the male facilities, those partnerships that they have with community entities is really what makes them work. They are not siloed. When I was in the track program, we would have representatives come in from the various trades that, especially the ones that have articulation agreements with those programs to accept folks that graduate. They would come in and do their entry-level testing. They would come in and share their stories. And now I get to go in and do the same thing for folks in there. And so as a track graduate, it's pretty fulfilling and pretty impactful. I wouldn't be here today without those partnerships and that training and the resources that helped me along the way, even after release. So a huge part of those efforts are not just preparing folks, but providing wraparound supports after they come out of incarceration. And then not too long ago here at the Building Trades Council, we started a second chance committee where we actually have folks, most of them with lived experience, but leaders from various trades who perform outreach in different parts of the states to these facilities, and that keep the relationship with the instructors and the prison staff as much as possible, just to help facilitate, folks through that reentry process and get them set up for success when they come home. And finally, I wanted to mention one thing about the education piece in a different light that's really, really important and part of the work that we do here. Someone can graduate from one of these prison programs, get released, get lined up with all of this community support that I'm talking about, and then boom, their probation officer, for some arbitrary reason, won't let them travel to the neighboring county. Could be like 5 miles. I mean, whatever the case is. Or for me, living in Vancouver, Washington, just right across the bridge to Portland to apply to the local that is housed right there across the bridge. And so some of the educating that we do is for, not just the track participant and the graduate and what the opportunities are that are available to them, but educating folks who have a stake in their success or who create barriers to their success. So that's there are still gaps there, and so there's still work to be done. So that's an important part of what we do here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Beth, would you say, is it fair to say that people with records tend to wind up in more exploitative relationships with their employees, with their employers compared with the general public? If so, why is that? And what are some of the ways to address that power imbalance?
Yeah, I think it is. I think all the examples that are being lifted up today really underline that is the case. Too often our conversations about workers' rights and reentry are separate, but the interests are, overlapping, they're aligned. If we're gonna ensure that all workers have access to good jobs, then we got to make sure that all workers have access to good jobs. And allowing employers to exploit workers through their workers with records, through underpaid, unsafe, precarious work, that can lower the floor for all workers, impacting wages and working conditions across the board. So we're all in this together. Let's keep that in mind. And so, we can't be satisfied with substandard jobs. It's unfair to the worker. It's unfair to their families, the communities that depend on them. And it detracts from the collective power of all workers. So I think I wanted to start with why it's so important to focus on job quality. But you asked how workers are exploited. And I think that there are a lot of different ways, but I think the crux of the issue is that when you allow employers to discriminate against workers with records based on convictions that have no real bearing on their ability to do the job, people with records end up rejected over and over again. That pattern makes people more desperate and more easily exploitable. For fear of being fired, people with records, are less likely to complain about wages or working conditions. I'll lift up one specific example from New York. It's an especially stark example. It was the body shop industry in New York. So what body shops are, what they call themselves, I should say, are private labor brokers that target workers on parole and supervision for dangerous temporary construction jobs. And it took workers and their local union, Laborers 79, demanding regulation of that industry to start to address the exploitation they were facing. I think, frankly, we expect people with records to be grateful for even the worst job opportunities. And, in addition to, just the overall discrimination, there are some things that exacerbate that problem. Minna touched on one, probation, parole requirements. People can be required to maintain employment as a condition of their parole or probation, under the ultimate threat of reincarceration. People with records have court-ordered debt to repay. People have curfews. They have monitoring requirements that can limit their job options. A lack of savings to fall back on. Often people with records are denied, the social safety nets that the rest of us can rely on if we don't have a job, SNAP, TANF, unemployment insurance. And workers on parole and probation can even be legally prohibited from going on strike to protest, bad working conditions. So there's a lot of ways that the power is skewed, and as a result, we set people with records up to be exploited.
Yeah, and I want to build off of what Minna and Beth have just mentioned. Gina, we've touched a lot on discrimination today, but as we're kind of getting into, it's also an issue that our economy has a lot of jobs that just broadly that don't pay well and don't offer good benefits or stability. You've done a lot of work advocating for higher minimum wage and better jobs. Talk to us about the importance of good jobs in the context of this conversation from a business perspective, and some of the things that you've tried to put in place to offer better jobs to your employees, including those who faced incarceration.
Sure. I really like this question because people have asked me over the years how many folks in recovery are coming home from prison I've had to fire or who have done something, nefarious at the job. But they never ask me how many folks who weren't in recovery or didn't face some sort of have some sort of relationship with the penal system. They never ask me the converse, which to me just means that the level playing field is not level in most people's minds. And we decided a long time ago that we wanted the playing field to be level. So let me back up into this a little bit. We started advocating on behalf of raising the minimum wage because 13 states still have the federal minimum wage. I think when we started our advocacy in 2011, something like 21 states were still paying $7.25 as the federal minimum wage, which hasn't been raised since 2009. Those are not livable wages for anybody. It doesn't matter where you live. However, now, 2025, I am not delusional enough to think that $18 minimum wage in Washington, D.C. is something that I want all of my teammates to have to live with the rest of their life, because D.C. is very expensive. So I always feel a little disingenuous when I talk about this, because we do pay, slightly above what the federal minimum or DC minimum wage is now, but I want people to learn something and move on. I think it is my responsibility to bring folks in at that pay grade, if that's all we can afford, and teach them and encourage them and then move them on to a higher paying job. And so that's kind of been our move through or move up process. Folks who have access to the benefits that we provide. And so we've added a whole host of services around the actual wage piece, which is across the board, no matter what your status with any kind of system is. Include health benefits, a 401k, paid leave, time off, vacation, all of the respectable things that we have in white collar jobs or our office jobs that are not always afforded for entry level or retail level jobs. And we offer those for a variety of reasons. One of the things that we realized a long time ago is that if you are being paid subpar wages and or in a subpar work environment, you may have to have 2 or 3 jobs. And that leads to a lot of instability for families. For me as an employer, frankly, if I'm being selfish about it, if I have to work around you having 2 or 3 schedules to juggle, there was a time where employers could change someone's schedule on a whim, which means if you're relying on those hours to feed your children or pay for your transportation and your boss says, sorry, we don't need you today, they were allowed on a moment's notice to change your schedule. And so when those things started to change, now you have to offer so many weeks in advance, we started adding those benefits into, some of them were legal, we had to, but adding on to just the entry-level wage that we were paying so that people could start to build a more stable life for themselves and or their families, regardless of whether or not they were coming home, regardless of what their history was. And then on top of that, I would say, people often talk about creating a workplace where you can bring your entire self to work. Now, this is an intangible. This is not a benefit. You don't put this in your pocket. But when you can start to create a culture where people can come to work and be who they are, and they're not worried to talk about all of the experiences that they've had in the past, they also start selfishly to become a better teammate, better at providing customer service, a better employee. And they give themselves, they earn for themselves really that stability that they need then hopefully to move on and up to something bigger and better. So I think that's really cool. The biggest benefit that we've provided, then I'll stop there, is in 2003, I decided I was going to step down as CEO. And as part of my succession plan, we created an ESOP, which is an employee stock ownership program. So essentially a trust that owns the company on behalf of the team. And this was probably, my favorite moment as a leader, because the day that we announced that we were forming an ESOP and the employees don't put any money in, 130 of my teammates automatically became owners, including one of my very dear teammates named Mike, who had been incarcerated. He had been homeless. He had dealt with substance issues. And when he retired from working on the sales floor at Logan Hardware, he retired as an owner in my company. And so that to me was the ultimate benefit to be able to offer to help level the playing field. And it's something that so many employers can do. It's not something that, somehow my company had the privilege to be able to do this.
Thanks so much, Gina. And I think that, not to put too fine a point on it, but one of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking was just that, good job, quote unquote, is somewhat subjective. And I think wages are the most obvious and probably the most pressing and important matter of what makes something a good job. But there's a wide spectrum of things that I think that need to be included in that conversation when we're talking about, people having access to good jobs. And that can include things like what you've mentioned in terms of ability to have an ownership stake, the culture of the place, the fringe benefits, all of these things. Like, it's wider than just wages, for as important as that is. Daryl, so we're going to stick on good jobs for a moment. You've been involved in this work from many different positions and angles, including through a presidential administration, as a grassroots activist, as an employer. What do you see as the biggest challenges, policy or otherwise, in providing access to good jobs?
Structural discrimination. We live in we all been swimming in this dirty pond. Let me just say it that way. I would be remiss if I didn't contextualize this moment in Black History Month. Diva Pager, a noted sociologist and criminologist who died a few years ago, did a study on the probability of people getting called back for jobs if they had a criminal record. And one of her baseline findings was that white men convicted of felonies got callbacks at higher rates than Black men without felonies who had college degrees. And I put that top line finding out to illustrate that we are swimming in a dirty pond of structural discrimination that we refuse to address forthrightly in this country. Black folks landed on the shores of this country in 1619 were emancipated in 1865, 246 years. 1865 to 2025 is 160 years. The math ain't mathing. Black people have been enslaved in this country longer than they've been free. In fact, it won't be until 2112 that Black people would have been free longer than this country than enslaved. So in that 60 years of, I mean, that 160 years of so-called freedom, from 1865 to 2025, you had 99 years of legalized apartheid called Jim Crow. Add that to the 246 of chattel slavery. We got 345 years of state-sponsored oppression from the government. And I want to be generous and say, since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, we've had 61 years of opportunity. So as the young people would say, the math ain't mathing. Formerly incarcerated people come into that existing structure when they're trying to get employment, housing, and a litany of other benefits. So the solutions to these issues are really deep, long-standing commitment. And we try to, at Forward Justice, try to be a value-based employer. It isn't about a program. It isn't about a project. It isn't about certain positions. It's value-based because we believe that people with lived experience can excel at any numbers of positions. I've been everything from a produce manager now to a licensed attorney and the executive director of $1 million, $2 million corporations. So the long-standing barriers that exist in this country, there's no single silver bullet. There's no one policy or program that's going to solve it. We have to have a deep, long-standing commitment to see ourselves in each other. To Beth's earlier point, we are better when we have a virtuous economy where everyone can participate, right? Where everyone can have an opportunity to be a contributor. And that's what we're striving for. You know, there have been waves of policy prescriptions that have been more popular during certain times. We talked about some of the fair hiring stuff. Now we have clean slate with cleaning records. There is no single thing that's going to do it for this population. We have to have a sustained commitment to address this particular problem, to remedy the state-sponsored harm that we've caused a majority group of these folks.
Daryl, I know you have a time commitment, so I'm actually want to stick with you for another question. You've done a lot of work to understand what people leaving incarceration see as the solutions. What is the value of having those voices represented and creating solutions? What are the challenges in engaging those voices, and what have you learned from that work?
Yeah, the value, I would say, it's you know, you can ground it in the academic literature. I was a part of the National Academy of Sciences that were looking at racial inequality in the criminal justice system. And one of the founding principles that they had, or tenets that they had, is that communities that are at the intersection of crime and violence, communities that are at the front door of these particular issues, have to be integral players in the formulation, the implementation, the evaluation of programs, policies, and procedures. That way, you know that the meal that's being prepared is going to be suitable for the folks that are sitting down to eat it, if you will. I've found that to be quite effective, not only for the efficacy of whatever particular program or policy that you're focusing on, but also for the culture shift. One of the things that I learned in the administration, Valerie Jarrett was said before every meeting when we were in the Obama administration, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And when you sit down with people different from you, so you got formerly incarcerated people, you got employers, you got licensing board people, you got risk management folks, and folks are working over a period of time to come up with a set of solutions. You know what happens, Jamiles? We find out that we aren't so different, that we don't have 5 heads and 6 arms, that you drop your kids off just like me at school, which I got to run and pick mine up from violin practice, that we go to church, that we shop at the supermarket, that we aren't so different, right? And when you can shrink that proximity of othering, because that's when we do bad shit. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to curse. That's when we do bad stuff to people. When we can other them and make them so different than us. When you can shrink that proximity, and I found that just putting people in the room and making them work across difference is a way to shrink that proximity. You start sharing stories, you start sharing air, you may even share a meal together and find out that we aren't so different and we all want the same things out of life.
Thank you so much, Daryl. We're going to let you run off to violin practice, but we really appreciate your insights today. Gina, Daryl mentioned culture and you know, that old adage that culture eats policy for breakfast. How can businesses build a workplace culture that is supportive of the success of those coming home and looking for opportunities? Describe some of the systems and processes and attitudes that you put in place to try to foster that.
I'm not sure I actually heard that phrase before, but I'm gonna tattoo it somewhere now. I think it's awesome. So I think I had the benefit of when I started the first location in 2003 to not know anything. I didn't know how to use tools. I didn't know how to run a business. I didn't know what I didn't know, which I think worked to my benefit. And I had the great fortune to read a couple books in those first couple years that really laid the foundation. I always wanted an adult to come save me. Who's the adult that can teach me what I don't know? And one of the very first adults that I turned to was Father Gregory Boyle at Homeboy Industries, which I feel like most of you probably know or have heard of. And he said in his first book, Tattoos on the Heart, that even gangs have a culture. And what that meant to me as a young leader was that if you wanted a culture that would not be associated with a gang, i.e. negative, you had to define it, nurture it, and grow it. And so one of the very first things we did as we were getting ready to expand was to document our core values. I hired a business coach. She was the adult in the room who taught me how to do this. And I think this is the foundation that every business owner needs to go through, which allows them to build the kind of open and inclusive and thoughtful work environment that we're trying to create here. So documenting what those core values are, layering on the policies and procedures that work for every single person in the organization, and then creating the non-negotiables that go along with it. And the non-negotiables for me were what really created, I probably have been teased about it, but a relationship with my team that is nurturing, not coddling. Everybody needs support in a workplace, regardless of where they've come from. And by nurturing, using the same values, the same procedures, the same non-negotiables, everybody has an opportunity to rise within that occasion. So I'll give you kind of a silly example, but I had a teammate who I loved, really, really good at her job. One of our non-negotiables was being late to work 14 times, which is a pretty generous rule. And we had to terminate this teammate because she was late 15 times to work. She liked her job so much that she every week until we gave her her job back. So you don't have to stick to those non-negotiables or those rules to, till you're blue in the face, but you have to have them so that everybody has a level playing field to know when they come to work, what's expected of them. Me as a leader, what kinds of things should I be upholding, training to, teaching, et cetera, and so on. And so laying the foundation of that culture by being completely honest about what you want to be when you grow up, meaning as a business, and then making sure that you had sound policies to build what you wanted to be, and then the repercussions, accountability, non-negotiables, whatever you want to call it. And I'll just reiterate again, because I don't think I can say this enough. This is what every good business owner should do, regardless of who and how you're trying to hire, which I think is I think they should hire the way we hire. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I love that story, actually. And it makes me think of, the concept of, the difference between, I apologize, I lost my train of thought. The story about, the difference between the letter of the law and the rule of the law, right? Like the point of a rule is to make sure that your employees, like that, would be that, your employees are committed to the work, they're committed to the workplace, they're committed to contributing. But by showing up and, by sort of showing that kind of stick-to-itiveness, you saw it. You didn't see it in the place where you expected to see it, but you ultimately saw it in a way that, while it may not have fit the letter of that rule, the spirit of that rule was embodied in a way that you were able to adapt and change and do something differently.
Yeah.
So sticking with laws and rules, Sharon, I would love for you to talk to us more about clean slate laws, how they work, and what you've seen as the impacts of those laws in Pennsylvania.
Thanks, I'd love to. So clean slate basically means a fairly simple concept that criminal cases can be cleared by automation, by a computer process. People ordinarily, before clean slate, had to get a lawyer and file a petition and go to court and pay a filing fee, et cetera, et cetera. And there were a lot of barriers along the way. And of course, people would get tripped up at any one of them and they were done. But clean slate basically does the work for you. You don't even need to know that you're eligible or how to proceed. It simply goes ahead and clears your case. Now, Pennsylvania was the first state to adopt clean slate in 2018. And since it went into effect in 2019, 55 million cases have been sealed in Pennsylvania in whole or in part by our clean slate process. Clean slate has now been passed in 12 states. Many more of them are considering a clean slate law. And why is it so important? Well, as I said before, the vast majority of CLS's clients who come in for help with their records are doing so to ask that their record be cleared. I mean, they could ask for a lot of things. They could ask for, my job back with the employer that fired me, or an occupational license, or many other things. But generally, they want it cleared because they know it gives them a second chance, not just at employment, but also at housing, education, lots of other stuff. So it is a very promising practice and law and policy. If you want to know more about it, I recommend to you the website for the Clean Slate Initiative, which is www.cleanslate.initiative.org.
Sharon, thanks so much. Minna, organized labor and unions have historically been on the front lines of trying to make sure that everyone has a good job. But historically, they haven't necessarily been proactive in support of those with a record. So what do you see as the role of organized labor in providing opportunities to people with a record, and what advice do you have to organizers and labor union allies?
So there's so much to this question. I wish I had more time to talk about this. But first, I don't think it's a secret on and off this call that society in general needs a cultural shift with how people with conviction history are viewed. There is a huge talent pool in the justice impacted community, and folks are missing out on great contributors to their workforce when they overlook a population of people for reasons that have nothing to do with the job in the first place. So obviously my first piece of advice would be to look at success stories. I mean, people on this call, there are so many success stories out there, and be open-minded to engaging with justice impacted individuals and to see how it can benefit your organization or your company. In Washington State, to be a little selfish, I think we set a really, really great example in terms of labor organizations, especially when you consider the articulation agreements that several trades in the state have with the prison-based pre-apprenticeship programs. Our Second Chance Committee that I mentioned earlier is comprised of representatives from multiple trades. Most of those folks have lived experience. And some of the barriers that folks with conviction history face in construction isn't not being able to get into the apprenticeship program because of their record. What I see more, and actually what I've experienced myself, is that you can get into the apprenticeship. It's really like, is there work available? Okay, yes, we need apprentices, so we're bringing people on. But it's more so not being able to get on job sites because of your record. So you could be an apprentice, you could be a union member, you could be, you know, an active electrician or a pipe fitter or a roofer or whatever, and you just can't go to certain job sites. And so you're limited in your ability to put food on the table for your family because of your record. Even when the door may be wide open to you to get into that apprenticeship. And so it really depends on the job. A lot of times it's federally prohibited. You know, I haven't been able to work, I can't work on a military base, right? I couldn't go, you know, do construction work there. The terminal side of the airport, you know, depending on the security level, sometimes it's just up to the client. If it's a private job, not a federal job. But I do want to mention that we have entities in Washington State. One of them is Sound Transit, who want people releasing from prison on their construction projects. They are vocal about it, and they are actively engaged with some of our apprenticeship programs to give those opportunities to those people. So that's one great example of how that open-mindedness can lead to success for everyone involved, both the employer, the people who are releasing and need those opportunities. So that's kind of some examples of like what's being done, what we need to continue capitalizing on, and the direction we need to keep going in.
Minna, thanks so much. Beth, I wanted to jump to the question of occupational licensure. From your perspective, you know, kind of give us the baseline situation with those licenses, how formerly incarcerated people are affected by them. And I guess part of the question I'm teasing here is there an issue about just equitable access to licensure, or is there an issue with occupational licensure altogether?
Wow. Yeah. I think your second question might take a whole debate of its own. Well, let me just start with addressing the question. So Daryl touched on, you know, our structural inequality earlier, and a big part of that is occupational segregation. You know, Black workers, women segregated into the lowest paid, dirtiest, most dangerous jobs, unstable, temp jobs, gig jobs. And the carceral system is a huge driver of that. Now, one clear example can be found in occupational licensing restrictions and how they impact people with records. You know, Sappho mentioned it earlier in her opening remarks. She talked about trying to get her MSW and you know, struggling to get a license. You know, it's very common for state occupational licensing boards or agencies to require strict background checks and good moral character assessments, very vague assessments, for individuals to be licensed for an occupation profession. And we're not just talking about, you know, doctors and nurses. A huge swath of jobs, something like 1/4 require a license or a certification to be able to do your job. So people are kept out of whole professions, never even submit a single job application. And so I think the real problem there is, you know, equitable access to those occupations. Like, we can't keep keeping people out because of records that don't affect their ability to do the job. It just doesn't make sense. There are certainly benefits, public health benefits, you know, wage benefits for the workers themselves to having licensure and certification. So on your second question, I'd say I lean more toward the former of your options.
Thank you so much. Looking at the time now, I think it would be a great moment for us to start shifting into question and answer mode. The first question I want to raise, possibly for Gina, would be, how do we get more employees engaged in this work and investing in the formerly incarcerated workforce? Like you mentioned, you know, that it'd be great for people to do, you know, more of how hire more in the ways that a few cool hardware stores hired. How do we get people to do that?
This is such a great question. I think I don't know if this answer is enough, but we have to talk about people like my business. And that's not saying I want you to talk about me, but 2 years ago, I wrote a book to tell our stories with the permission of my team. And one of the really cool things that came out of the book events, we're finding companies across the country who do similar who have similar hiring practices. And so now I talk about those businesses. Most of them I've never been to. Some of them I have only barely heard of. But I think the one thing that we have to do is continuously be lifting up what we do to other employers, which is why I don't mind being called crazy, or why I continued to put up with that when I was younger and building my business, because I wanted everyone to know that we as a team were successful, and this is how we were hiring. So I think we have to talk about it. We need folks like the Aspen Institute who are writing about it. We need journalists who are sharing the stories of success all across the country, from unions to everyone, who are lifting up all the employees, and then continuing to show that it is possible and we are successful, I think, because of it.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question that I actually had when I was listening to Sappho speak. And I hope we could potentially get Sappho back on to answer this question, but I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on it, which is really like, we've spent a lot of time talking about the specific barriers that formerly incarcerated people face in seeking employment. But there are also specific strengths that I think formerly incarcerated people bring to the labor market that people who have not been inside do not have. And I guess I was wondering if that's a theme that anyone would like to elaborate on or expand on. I see Sappho here. So is that something that you might want to chime in on?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. So just that, a lot of our conversation has been about the restrictions and barriers that formerly incarcerated folks face in trying to get jobs and good jobs. But one of the things that when you were speaking that I was thinking about is that formerly incarcerated people also bring specific strengths, I think, to the workplace that potential employees who have not been incarcerated just don't have. And I guess I just was wondering if that's a theme you could expand on.
Yeah, I was listening to the talk and everyone did a great job. I think that you're spot on by saying that they bring particular strengths. I think that, as a personal assessment, I think as an employer and as someone that is justice impacted, I think that it makes sense to say that sometimes I have to step back and not be so critical, not be so judgmental about how I expect a person to act or respond. Do you know what I mean? While holding a person accountable. Thank you, Gina, for saying that. While holding a person accountable for showing up and being being responsible on the job. I think that, kind of like, trusting a person. Trusting that the person is going to do a good job. I don't know if I kind of answered your question, because I really don't like to answer for like everybody. I can't answer. I think it's like an individual case by case base. I think my determination, I remember being incarcerated, like I said, over 20-something years, and I would get up every morning and I wanted to come outside of myself and I wanted to clean in front of the unit. I wanted to clean outside, Thank you, Gina. But yeah, I wanted to clean. I wanted to work. I went to school when I was upstate, and I came home and my certification from upstate didn't work for out here. I love what Minna was talking about, like taking those programs inside and bringing those certifications outside of the penitentiary. And, because those certifications don't come outside. They're very rare and few, like recently, Jevs, they have you in there, you buff the floors, but you don't get a certification in buffing the floors. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know if that answers your question per se.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think Gina also had some thoughts on this question too.
Well, I would just say that, in some broad strokes, some of the things that we've experienced over the years is resiliency, resourcefulness, the ability to get the job done no matter what, because, frankly, folks are happy to have a job, and I'm not saying they should be happy to have a job, but they are. And so the ability to show up on time because you're used to your life being regimented. Now, these might seem a little, these are the things that we've seen: being happy to have a place to go, feeling a sense of community. I mean, this has been particularly true in our folks from the recovery community, but there's a lot of overlap. Feeling that sense of community and a belonging in a safe space where you can come. And I've seen this over and over again, trying to get, make yourself better so you're helping your team get better, learning everything that you can, showing up on time, definitely being resourceful. I mean, I fortunately have never had to spend any time in a prison, but when I see some of the skill sets of folks who have had to do so much with so little, it's very impressive. And so that served a lot of my teammates well.
Can I
That makes a
respond
lot
to
of
Gina?
sense. Oh, yeah.
Respond to Gina. Gina, thank you for saying that, because it is about belonging. It is about, do you trust me? Will you give me a chance? I'm going to show you. And I'm trying to really kind of take myself back to 20 years of coming home from jail and now working with persons coming home from jail. But I remember that feeling like, it was such an honor to say, like, do you trust me? Will you give me a chance? Let me show you that I will be the best worker that you have. But that's a two-way street. Because that's what this conversation is about. Like, I'm human. I'm not going to hurt you or rob you or do anything wrong to you. I personally am not. But that's a two-way street. Are you going to value me and pay me and respect me as someone that is giving you that much of myself?
Yeah. Sappho, can I ask another question to you, which is, how do you prepare people for job searches and interviews? Like, what are some of the specific things that you try to bring into that process?
Yeah, great question. I think it's really about interviewing, what not to do. Some of the biggest things is like, completing the application, and we do a lot of emotional regulation, alternative therapeutic modality, breath work, yoga, because literally the trauma that a person experiences from incarceration is so devastating that paralyzing fear comes up in moments and you would not even understand where it's coming from on the outside, but it's happening on the inside. So we do a lot of emotional regulation work. Yeah, dressing up, constantly, positive affirmations. We do also restorative justice training, and we are consistent. And we don't exploit their time. We also give them a stipend and a, good job. I see you, a certificate of completion once they're done. And we give them, I got twisted, and we give them food. And we feed them. Good food is always an incentive.
May I just interject just to point out one thing? I think it's important to note that, everyone speaking today has underlined how workers with records are, defying negative stereotypes, have unique traits, are individuals. We're not making broad categorizations. And I think it's important to note that, one potentially harmful narrative that we can get into if we keep going down this road is telling employers that the reason they should hire people with records is that those records are going to be so grateful for the opportunity. They'll be the most loyal, most reliable, dependable, hardest working employees. And while that may sometimes, might sometimes be the case, it's almost reinforcing the exploitation that I was talking about earlier. Folks are so desperate that they're going to accept lower wages, worse conditions. And so, yeah, and it can also set unrealistic expectations for employers. Like, people with records don't need to be the best worker. They just they can be like everyone else, right?
Wow. That's a good point. Thank you.
Absolutely. One question we have here is, what can workforce development organizations do to help more people access good jobs rather than just jobs? So I think this is a question specifically, from folks in that workforce development space. If anyone has anything to instruct.
Well, I'd like to have everybody's number that is hiring, because the one thing about workforce development is a job referral. Like, don't have me go through all that and then you don't have a job for me to go to once I complete the program. I would love to send folks that finish our workforce development straight into the trades union. You know what I mean? So, Gina, people would love to own a hardware store. Like, please, let's make sure that we make these things accessible. Like, are you hiring on the spot? Don't just show up at a job fair. So workforce development is about referral systems.
Great, thank you so much. And then I think, at this point, We had one question, someone asked, where can we learn more about these issues and more about collateral consequences? So I'm going to toss that to our group to either sort of mention a place of resources or more information that you think is helpful, or to just give us some general parting thoughts or final thoughts for our panel. And whoever wants to grab the baton.
I'll jump in. I think it's important to echo what Daryl put so well earlier, is that, there are lots of different, policy approaches. There are lots of different ways that we can get at this problem, and we need to be doing all of it, that there's not going to be one policy that's a silver bullet, one approach. It's going to take reentry, and it's going to take training and apprenticeships. It's going to take supports for people just out. It's going to take stronger anti-discrimination protections and enforcement. It's going to take all of these things. And so, as a result, there are so many resources. Sharon did a great job of pointing you to a bunch throughout. I'll say that one place that I love to read and learn from is the Prison Policy Initiative. Their resources, PPI, it's really fantastic.
If there's someone listening who's a small business owner or an entrepreneur or a wannabe entrepreneur, small business owner, I am always more than welcome or more than happy to chat about what we've done and how we've done it, and sort of strategically think through creating a culture that allows you to be supportive for all of your team. So I'm happy to talk to anyone about that.
Sappho, Sharon, Minna, anything else before we wrap up today?
I would also like to jump on that bandwagon there. If there's anybody listening who is interested in looking at like a pre-apprenticeship models for the incarcerated space, I do know that there are at least 2 other states in the recent years who have started modeling after the track program here in Washington State, and expanding those opportunities for folks in their prisons. New Mexico, I think potentially Delaware. But if that's something that folks are interested in doing, we can get you connected to your local building trades councils, so on and so forth. So feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it could be an alternative even to incarceration. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I will be in touch. Thank you. And thank you, Jamiles,
Yes.
for the Marshall article. I just had to throw that in there because I love the Marshall article. I read it all the time, every day.
That means the world to us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just
Hey, I
echo.
think
Go ahead, Jamiles.
I was going to turn it over to you, Matt.
I was gonna echo just appreciation for the Marshall Project and all the great reporting and work they do. But thank you so much to Daryl, to Sappho, to Beth, to Sharon, to Minna, to Gina, and to Jamiles again for a great conversation. I think one of the things I heard and that I'm walking away with is that there are a lot of people looking for answers and solutions. And many of you, I think, are sitting directly across from individuals who are really struggling to navigate these systems and to think about how they build a better life for ourselves. But kind of going back to what Daryl said, I think there, and what others have echoed, is there's no silver bullet solution. And if there are solutions, they really are at the more systemic and structural level, which means a sustained commitment to doing more policy work, to doing more community organizing, to thinking really about those bigger structures, those bigger policies, those bigger systems, and how we influence those, because those are the things that are pressing down on individuals that we need to fix if we're gonna make progress for everyone. I also love the conversation around culture. I think that conversation is not just a conversation to be had in our workplaces, but it's really about culture within our communities and what today's conversation means for fostering a better culture within the places that we live, with our neighbors, with our business owners, and with others that we see at school events and whatnot. So thank you all for a great conversation. I'm certainly walking away with a lot. I know we probably could have got to a lot more. Certainly, you know, you have a number of speakers here who I think are willing to be resources to you. If you need help reaching out to them, please reach out to us at Aspen. Stay tuned for our next event. Like I said, it's going to be on March 19th. It's called Driving the Economy. That is the essential and undervalued work of truckers. Thank you to our team at Architects for putting on today's event, and to our team at the Aspen Institute, including Finney, again, Tony, Nora, Francis, Merritt, Maxwell, and thanks to our executive director, Maureen, for all her support in this. And we'll see you next time. So thanks so much for joining us today.